30 days. That is how long the human body can survive without food before the organs begin to consume themselves in sequence. The heart muscle thins. The brain, starved of glucose, begins to fracture reality into something that only partially resembles the world. And somewhere around day 20, in the dark, a snowbound cabin at 11,000 feet in the Sierra Nevada, with the wind outside registering temperatures that freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes, a thought arrives that no amount of civilization, no amount of faith, no amount of love for the people sitting across from you in that darkness can fully suppress. You look at the body in the corner, the one that stopped breathing 3 days ago, and the thought does not feel like a choice anymore. It feels like arithmetic. Welcome to the raw frontier. This is our 10th episode, and we have saved the darkest corner of the frontier for this milestone. Today you are going to confront the absolute boundary of human survival, the biology of starvation at its terminal stage, the moment when the moral architecture that defines what a person believes themselves to be collapses under a weight that no one who has not been there can honestly claim they would withstand, and what the rescue parties found when the snow finally melted and they reached the camps in the spring. The image that history handed down to most of us about the westward migration is one of hardship worn with dignity. Families in covered wagons, pushing through difficulty toward promise, sustained by faith and stubbornness and the American conviction that the next ridge would reveal something better. For most migrants, the Sierra Nevada was the final obstacle. Cross the mountains before the autumn snow, close the passes, and California was within reach. Cut it too close, and the mountains became something else entirely. The Donner Party was not the only group trapped by early Sierra Nevada snowfall during the years of peak migration. They are the most documented, the most studied, the most written about. But the dynamic they experienced, the sequence from hope to deprivation to something beyond deprivation, was not unique to them. It was a nightmare at the end of the trail that every immigrant party understood was possible, and that most preferred not to think about too directly. When the snow came in October of 1846, it came fast and without sufficient warning, and in quantities that made any forward movement through the passes impossible. The wagons stopped. The camps were established with the expectation, reasonable at the time, that the snow would clear and the crossing would resume within days. Days became weeks. Weeks became a month. And the food that had been rationed for a journey was now being rationed for a siege that had no defined end. The livestock died first, or were killed first, which amounts to the same outcome. The oxen that had pulled the wagons across 2,000 miles of continent were slaughtered, and their meat packed in snow to preserve it. Nothing was discarded. The organs that would have been considered waste under normal circumstances were consumed with the same priority as the muscle, the eyes, the tissue around the skull, the contents of the stomach cavity. When you're looking at the caloric mathematics of survival, no portion of an animal represents waste. The dogs came next. The animals that families had brought from their homes back east, that had traveled the entire trail alongside the wagons, that children had names for, were killed and eaten with the same necessity. There is no record of this being easy. There is ample record of it being done anyway, because the alternative was dying faster. When the animals were gone, the survivors turned to what remained in the camp that could theoretically be processed into something the digestive system might extract nutrition from. The green rawhide of ox yokes and harness straps was boiled for hours until it softened into a gelatinous paste that contained almost no caloric value, but gave the stomach something to respond to, some chemical signal that resembled the act of eating without delivering anything meaningful behind it. Bearskin rugs, leather boots cut into strips and rendered down to a thick, foul-smelling glue. The survivors ate these things not because they believed they were being nourished, but because the act of chewing and swallowing was the only thing available to perform in the place where eating used to be. Understand what starvation at this depth actually does to a body, because it is not simply hunger scaled upward. It is a systematic dismantling. The fat reserves go first, mobilized by the body as emergency fuel. When those are gone, the body pivots to muscle tissue, consuming itself with a metabolic efficiency that produces visible deterioration within days. The face hollows. The limbs thin to a degree that makes the joints appear swollen by contrast. The teeth, deprived of the minerals that diet normally replenishes, begin to loosen in the gums. The cold, which was already the dominant environmental threat, became more lethal as the insulating tissue that normally sits beneath the skin disappeared. Survivors describe being unable to feel their own extremities. Fingers and toes going white, then dark, then numb in a way that stopped registering as sensation at all. The mind fractures under this compound assault. Sleep and wakefulness become indistinguishable. Hallucinations arrive not as obviously unreal visions, but as entirely convincing overlays on the real environment. The smell of cooking food so precise and so overwhelming that people stood up and searched the camp for a source that did not exist. The capacity for abstract reasoning, for planning, for holding a coherent thought across more than a few seconds, degraded in ways that survivors later described as a kind of dissolution of the self. The person they had been before the snow trapped them was retreating, being replaced by something older and more elemental that operated on a narrower set of imperatives. It was in this condition, the state of advanced physiological collapse and psychological fracture, that the deaths within the camp began, not murders. The historical record is consistent on this point. The first people who died in the Sierra Nevada camps died of starvation and cold. They were the weakest, the oldest, those whose reserves had run out first. They died in the night, or they simply stopped responding, and the camp woke to find that the number of living had decreased again. The bodies were placed in the snow, where the cold preserved them, and then the arithmetic that had been building for weeks completed itself. What was decided in those camps was not decided lightly and was not decided quickly. The account of survivors made clear that the barrier between what they had been raised to consider absolutely unthinkable and what they ultimately did was not crossed in a single moment of desperation. It was approached over days, retreated from, approached again, argued against, prayed against, and finally crossed when the alternative, the death of the living alongside the already dead, became the only alternative remaining. The agreement that emerged was one that the survivors clearly constructed as a psychological containment mechanism, an attempt to preserve some architecture of identity inside an act that threatened to demolish it entirely. No one would be harmed to provide for the others. Only those who had already died would be used, and families would not consume their own relatives. The remains would be exchanged between groups. This arrangement, clinical and desperate in equal measure, was the survivor's attempt to maintain a boundary, any boundary, between necessity and something worse. What the survivors described afterward about the sensory experience of that act is consistent across multiple independent accounts, and is one of the most disturbing consistencies in the historical record precisely because of how mundane it is. The smell of the meat cooking over the fire was not alien. It was not the smell of something clearly other. It was familiar in a way that triggers the deepest form of revulsion, because familiarity was the last thing anyone in that camp wanted to encounter. The biological relief that followed, the caloric restoration that the body registered immediately and responded to with a warmth and clarity that had been absent for weeks, arrived wrapped in a psychological cause that none of the survivors ever found language sufficient to describe. The body was grateful. The person inside the body was not. Several survivors refused entirely. They chose starvation over crossing of that boundary and died holding that choice. This is documented. Their decision is part of the record alongside the decisions of those who chose differently. History does not permit a simple moral verdict on either. When the rescue parties from California finally broke through the passes in late February and into March of 1847, they did not find the camps in the condition of a tragedy. They found the camps in the condition of a scene that several of the rescuers later wrote had permanently altered their understanding of what human beings were capable of doing and enduring. The evidence of what sustained the survivors was not hidden. It could not be hidden. The bones were there. Some had been cracked along their length in the manner used to access the marrow, which contains dense concentrations of fat and nutrients, and which represents, in conditions of extreme starvation, a meaningful caloric resource. The skulls of some of the dead showed the particular marks left by the process of accessing brain tissue, which similarly contained significant caloric density. The children who were rescued were alive. Some of them were very young. The adults who had kept them alive had made decisions that no moral framework developed in a comfortable environment can adequately evaluate, and those adults knew it, and they carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. The survivors returned to society, and society was not equipped to receive them without judgment. The stare that other people described on the faces of those who had endured the Sierra Nevada winter was not the stare of guilt. Exactly. though guilt was certainly present. It was a stare of people who had seen something in themselves that cannot be unseen, who had crossed a threshold that exists in all human beings and discovered, on the other side of it, that they were still breathing, that survival had been achieved, that the cost of that survival was a question they would be asked, silently or explicitly, by every person they encountered for the remainder of their years. They had gone into the mountains as pioneers. They came out as something the 19th century did not have a clean category for. Survivors of an experience so far outside the boundaries of normal human life that the word survivor feels insufficient. The American frontier was not built only on heroism. It was built on the full spectrum of what human beings become when the world strips away every resource, every comfort, and every option except the most primal one. Some of what was built in those years was noble. Some of it was buried in the snow of the Sierra Nevada and never spoken about directly again. All of it was real. Now answer honestly. 30 days without food. The temperature outside is 30 below. Someone in your group has just died of causes entirely beyond anyone's control, and the people still alive are days from the same end. You have children with you. The snow is not moving. The rescue party, if one is coming at all, is weeks away. What do? There is no comfortable answer, and you know it. Leave it in the comments. We want the honest version, not the version you would give in polite company. And if you believe that what happened in those mountain camps represents the worst way the frontier dealt with death, click on our video about what happened inside the towns below those mountains, where undertakers were sealing pine boxes that the summer heat was turning into something no church was built to contain. The dead in the frontier settlements had their own particular horror waiting for them. Find out what it was. Raw, visceral, history. This is a raw frontier.